On his 18th birthday, a boy walked out of the county system with a single black trash bag and a deed to land no banker in 3 counties would touch with a 10-foot pole. What he found on that land wasn't just acres of scrub and forgotten fence line. It was the proof that everyone who had ever written him off had been wrong from the very beginning. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever had someone look right through you and see nothing worth saving, hit that subscribe button. This story is for you. The day I turned 18 felt less like a birthday and more like being handed a bill for a life I hadn't agreed to live. There was no cake. There was no party. There was Mrs. Gable's office, which smelled of stale coffee and something close to resignation, and a cardboard box that held every physical object I owned in the world. 2 pairs of jeans, 3 shirts, a worn paperback of Walden that someone had left in the common room years ago, and a photograph of a man I barely recognized, holding a child I had been told was me. Mrs. Gable was a small woman with steel gray hair and eyes that had been kind once. A long time ago, before the job had ground the softness out of them. She had a way of looking at you that told you she had done this particular thing too many times to feel it anymore. "You're 18 today, Leo," she said. Her voice was flat, the same temperature as the gray October air pressing against the window. "That means you're eligible for the transition stipend." She slid a check across the desk. $250. I stared at it like it was written in a language I didn't speak. "Good luck," she said, and her eyes were already drifting toward the next file on her stack. I picked up the check. I picked up the cardboard box. I walked out of the Grayfield County Group home for the last time, with the kind of freedom that feels exactly like falling. I was 4 blocks away, standing at a bus stop in a thin jacket that was not built for October, when I remembered the envelope. It had come in the mail 3 weeks before, addressed to me in handwriting so spidery and compressed it looked like a language made up of fence posts and wire. Mrs. Gable had given it to me, said it was from an attorney's office, and told me I should open it on my birthday. I don't know why I had listened. I wasn't usually a rule-following kind of person. I set the cardboard box on the bench and tore the envelope open. Inside was a letter on thick cream paper and a single key attached to a tag with 2 words written on it in the same cramped hand. Vanceland. I had no idea the envelope in my hand was about to change everything. The attorney's office was on the 2nd floor of a building near the courthouse, up a staircase that smelled of old paper and furniture polish. I found it because a woman at the bus station let me use the payphone to call the number on the letterhead. The attorney's name was Mr. Alistair Finch. He told me to come that afternoon. He was older than I expected, with thin white hair combed neatly back from his forehead and a trimmed beard the color of birch bark in winter. He looked at me over the top of his spectacles, the way men do when they are trying to decide whether you are worth the time it takes to explain things clearly. Apparently, I passed some test I hadn't known I was sitting, because he gestured to the chair across from his desk and he started talking. "Your grandfather, Arthur Vance, died 14 months ago," he said. His voice was a dry rustle, like someone turning the pages of a very old book. "He left his holdings in trust until your 18th birthday. That trust expires today. You are the sole beneficiary." I waited. I had learned early in life that when someone says something enormous, the best thing to do is wait, because there is always a but. The estate consists of 217 acres in the hill country northeast of Hardin's Creek, Mr. Finch said. He set a survey map on the desk and turned it so I could see. There is a main cabin, a stone outbuilding, a collapsed section of fence line, and a dry creek bed that has not run water in 20 years. The county assessed the land at $1,100, and they assessed it generously. He looked over his spectacles again. There is also an outstanding transfer fee. $5. $5. I had 250. I could manage $5. There's something else, mister, Finch said, and now his voice shifted slightly, the way a door shifts on a hinge when the wind changes direction. A developer has made an inquiry. Oak Ridge Development. They've offered $8,000 for the parcel. Cash, clear deed. They want an answer within 60 days. $8,000. I thought about an apartment deposit. I thought about a real bed, a real door with a real lock, a place where no one could tell me what time to be home. I looked at the survey map. 217 acres that no water ran through, that no bank would touch, that a company wanted for $8,000. Something in my chest pulled tight. I didn't know what it was then. I know now it was my grandfather's blood. I'm not selling, I said. I want to see it. It was the most reckless thing I had ever said. It was the only honest thing I had said in years. The bus north out of the city took 2 hours, and when I stepped off at Hardin's Creek, the air was a different substance than city air. Cold in a way that had pine needles in it, and damp earth, and something mineral and clean that I had no name for. The sky above the hills was the color of pewter, heavy and still. There was a diner on the main street called Marta's, and I went inside because my hands were numb, and I had $6 left, and I thought maybe someone could tell me how to get to a place called Vanceland. The woman behind the counter had iron gray hair pulled back with a hardware store clip in hands that had been working their whole lives. Her name was Martha. When I said the name, Vance, she stopped pouring coffee and looked at me the way people look at something they weren't expecting to see again. "Arthur Vance's grandson?" she said. "Lord, you've got his chin. You've got his chin and the same stubborn set to your jaw." She poured me a cup of coffee without asking and slid it across the counter. He used to come in here every Tuesday, fought the county tax assessor for 11 years over that land, said there was something on it worth protecting. She shook her head slowly. "Son, you look like you've been through a war and lost twice." "Something like that," I said. She told me how to get there. 4 miles north, on the county road, left at a stand of white oaks, then a track that the map called a road but which was really a creek bed that hadn't decided what it wanted to be. I walked it. The cabin appeared around a bend in the track and I stopped. It was worse than I had expected, and I had expected very little. The porch had sagged on one end, like a tired shoulder. The roof had a section of tar paper that had peeled back, exposing dark, blistered wood beneath. The windows were intact, which was the one mercy. The yard was a tangle of dead grass and wild sage, and the stone outbuilding at the back sat low and thick-walled, its door sealed with a padlock that had gone red with rust. I almost turned around. My feet were cold, and the sky was threatening something worse than its current gray. 217 acres of problem, and $8,000 that would have bought me a door that locked from the inside. I'm glad I didn't turn around. What I saw waiting inside that padlock changed everything. The key from the envelope fit the outbuilding's padlock, not the cabin. I stood in front of the stone door for a long moment, the wind pressing through the sage and dying grass around me, and then I put the key in and turned it. It resisted. The tumblers were stiff with years of disuse, and the key grated against metal and rust, and then caught, and there was a loud, satisfying clunk as the lock sprang free. I lifted the padlock off the hasp and pulled the door open. A wave of air came out at me, thick, cold, smelling of damp earth and rust and something else underneath, something older, like pine resin and oil-stained wood and the faint, distant ghost of pipe tobacco. The air had been trapped in there a long time. I stepped inside. The outbuilding was larger than it looked from outside. Stone walls, a packed dirt floor, a ceiling of rough timber beams that had gone dark with age. Shafts of gray light came through two small windows near the roofline, thick with dust. When I breathed, the dust moved in the light like slow snow. It felt like walking into something sacred, like a place that had been waiting. At the center of the room, under the strongest shaft of light, sat a wooden workbench. And on the workbench, placed with a deliberateness that stopped me cold, sat a row of glass mason jars with their lids sealed tight. I walked toward them slowly. The jars were full of something that was not preserves. In the dim light, it took me a moment to understand what I was looking at. Bills. Each jar was packed with paper currency, rolled tight and sealed under the lid with wax, the way another man's grandfather might have sealed tomatoes for winter. My hands were shaking when I lifted the first jar. I had to work the lid twice before it came free. And when it did, a roll of bills dropped into my palm. I counted slowly. The bills were worn, but real. $1,000. I set the jar down and counted the row. 20 jars. My mind refused to understand what it was seeing. $20,000 in glass jars on a workbench in a stone outbuilding on land a banker had told me was worth the paper it was printed on. I sat down hard on the cold earth floor, my back against the workbench leg, my knees pulled to my chest. A sound came out of me that I didn't recognize at first, something between a laugh and something that had lived in my chest for years with no way out. Then the laughter broke and turned into something else entirely. I sat on that cold floor, and I cried in a way I hadn't cried since I was 7 years old, big heaving sobs that echoed off the stone walls. When I could breathe again, I looked up. At the bottom of the shelf beneath the workbench, behind a loose stone I hadn't noticed before, there was a leather pouch. Inside the pouch was a folded envelope and a single piece of paper, hand-drawn, that I slowly understood was a map. I turned it in the light. It showed the property. And in the northeast corner, marked with a circle and 3 words I didn't yet understand, it said, Aquifer. Vance writes. I did not open the envelope that night. I held it for a long time. The letter was addressed in the same compressed wire fence handwriting as the tag on the key. Leo. Just that. My name, with a period after it, the way a man states a fact he is certain of. Leo, if you are reading this, it means you found this place, which means you did not sell it, which means you are more like me than I had any right to hope. I want you to know that first. You are more like me than I had any right to hope. I had to stop reading. I sat with the letter in my lap for a while. I am going to tell you 2 things. The first is that I never stopped looking for you. When your mother passed and the state took you, I hired 3 lawyers and spent 4 years fighting to bring you home. I was too old, they said, and too poor, and the land was too remote. I kept fighting anyway. I lost. But I never stopped, Leo. I want you to know that. What happened was not abandonment. It was a war I did not have the weapons to win. I read that sentence 3 times. Each time it meant something different. The second thing is about the land, what Oak Ridge Development wants. What every developer who has come sniffing around this county for the past 15 years has wanted, is what is underneath it. There is an aquifer beneath the northeast corner of this property. It was surveyed in 1962 by a hydrogeologist named Purvis, who was hired by Omnicorp to assess water resources in the hill country. They made him sign a non-disclosure. He signed it. But he also slipped a copy of his survey to my father, your great-grandfather, who had been quietly fighting the county's water board for 30 years. That survey is in the county courthouse. It is a matter of public record. Nobody looked for it, because nobody knew to look. The aquifer feeds 12 miles of surface water, east of here. 6 farms depend on it. 3 town wells depend on it. If a developer seizes this land and puts a resort or a subdivision on that northeast corner, they can legally control the water table for the whole valley. The deed to this property includes mineral and water rights, registered in 1943, never sold, never severed. They are yours. They cannot be bought away from you without your signature. They cannot be condemned under eminent domain because they are not the land itself but the rights appurtenant to it, and those rights attach to the water that feeds 6 farms and 3 towns. The foundation of this property is not the cabin. It is not the stone outbuilding. It is what runs beneath the ground, invisible, feeding everything around it. Take care of it, Leo. It was worth protecting. So were you. So were you. The last line was underlined twice. The foundation is the key. Everything starts with the foundation. The weeks after that were the hardest kind of work I had ever done, and they were also the best. I learned things hands learn that books cannot teach. I learned that a collapsed porch section can be rebuilt with salvaged barn planks if you are patient and willing to haul them on your back, and your hands blister, and the second day your shoulders ache so deeply you can feel it in your teeth. I learned that a cast iron stove, properly cleaned and polished and fitted with new pipe, will heat a stone cabin through a hill country winter better than anything modern they make now. George, who ran the hardware store in Hardin's Creek, let me open a tab. He didn't make a production of it. He wrote my name in a ledger with a stub of pencil and nodded like the arrangement was already done. Martha from the diner dropped off a box of pots and pans and kitchen tools one morning with no explanation and drove away before I could say thank you. A retired electrician named Henry showed up one afternoon and said he'd heard I was working on the old Vance place and did I need the wiring grounded. I said I didn't have money to pay him. He said he hadn't asked for money. He worked for 3 days. I fed him stale coffee and what I could manage on the camp stove, and he seemed satisfied. The community was choosing sides, and it turned out the community remembered Arthur Vance. Oak Ridge Development was not as patient as the hill country. A second letter arrived 6 weeks after I had moved into the cabin. Formal letterhead. Legal language. A new offer, $25,000. I put it on the workbench beside the empty mason jars and went back to sanding floors. Then came the threats. A letter from a county official citing a potential blight designation. A visit from a man in an expensive coat who parked his clean truck at the end of the track and walked up and stood in my yard and told me about all the progress that was going to come to this valley whether I cooperated or not. I told him I was busy. He smiled the way people smile when they believe they are about to win something. I walked into Mr. Finch's office 2 weeks later, not knowing it would be the most important meeting of my life. There were 2 of them at the table, both in suits that cost more than my grandfather's truck would have cost in its good years. One was older, heavy through the shoulders, with a manner that wanted to seem fatherly. The other was younger and kept his hands very still on the table in front of him. Neither of them offered a hand to shake. They talked about community and progress and the good that development could bring to struggling rural areas. They talked about partnership. They talked the way men talk when they have decided the outcome already. Then the older one opened a folder and slid a page across the table. $250,000. A check with my name on it. already filled in. The number sat on the table between us, and it was a real number. It was a life-changing number. It was a number that could have bought my grandfather's fight back, bought the years the system had taken, bought every cold night and every hard bed and every group home I had ever moved through. My eyes rested on it for a long time. I thought about the way the frozen ground had felt under my knees the morning I patched the east wall with mortar I had mixed by hand in a steel pail. I thought about a promise I had made to myself, standing in that stone outbuilding, looking at 20 jars of glass and paper and a grandfather's impossible, faithful love. I thought about the letter. I thought about the 6 farms and the 3 town wells and the aquifer running invisible and cold and alive beneath the northeast corner of 217 acres that a banker had thrown in the trash. No, I said. The older man's face did something complicated. The younger man's hands were still on the table. I have a counter, I said. I had spent 3 nights at the town library writing it out in pencil on yellow legal paper. I laid it on the table between us. Oak Ridge Development could lease the northeast corridor of the property for a conservation easement at a rate of $800 per acre per year, payable in perpetuity, with a covenant that prohibited any construction within 200 feet of the aquifer boundary. In exchange, the water rights would be held in trust, a community trust, registered with the county, administered by a board of 7 local residents. The trust would set priority water rates for all 6 farms in the valley and the 3 town wells that depended on the aquifer. The rates would be locked for 30 years. Oak Ridge Development would get access to the land they wanted for resort development on the Northwest Acres. They would get their roads, their infrastructure, their tax incentives. What they would not get was control of the water. The older man read the counter-proposal without expression. The younger man read it twice. They did not answer me that day. They gathered their papers and they left, and the door swung shut behind them with a soft, final sound. But there was a man sitting at the back of that room who had not spoken the entire meeting. I had not noticed him until then. He stood up slowly. He was a big man, unhurried in his movements, with a county sheriff's badge on his chest, and a face that had the particular quality of a man who had been waiting a long time to see something. He walked past the 2 Oak Ridge men in the hallway, and he stopped in front of them, right there in front of everyone who was watching, and he said, loud enough to carry, "Boys, I had a conversation with the county water board last week, and I pulled the 1962 Purvis survey from the courthouse records yesterday afternoon. I think you know what's in it." He looked at them for a moment. "I think you've known for a long time." He tipped his hat to me. Then he walked out. Oak Ridge Development signed the easement and the Community Water Trust 12 days later. The contract was filed at the courthouse on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. Mr. Finch called me and told me, and I drove back to the property in the truck I had bought for $400 from a man in town whose knees had given out and who didn't need it anymore. The truck smelled of oil and old vinyl, and the heater worked on the passenger side only, and I had never been so glad of anything in my life. I walked up the track to the cabin in the last light of the afternoon. The porch was solid now, under my boots. The windows were clean. From the chimney, a thread of wood smoke curled up into a sky that had finally gone from pewter to something that had blue in it. I stepped inside and flipped the switch by the door. The light came on, real electricity, run from a pole George had helped me get permitted 3 weeks back. I stood there in the light for a moment with the faded photograph from the cardboard box in my hand, the man I had barely recognized, the child I had been, and I looked at the faces for a long time. It wasn't a house, it was a home. And I had built it myself, with my grandfather's faith and a key and $5 and 217 acres of land that a banker had thrown in the trash. This is the place I stand on sometimes now, on the porch in the early morning when the frost is still in the grass and the hills are the color of iron and sage, and I think about all the things a person can inherit without knowing. I inherited the stubbornness. I inherited the conviction that what is underneath the ground matters more than what shows on the surface. I inherited the understanding that the most valuable things in this world are often the ones nobody else can see the worth of. I think about a banker holding a deed and deciding it was worthless. I think about a developer who sat across a table and believed that enough money would move anyone. I think about a sheriff standing in a hallway in front of everyone, tipping his hat. My grandfather spent 4 years fighting for me in a war he couldn't win. He couldn't give me what he wanted to give me when I needed it most. So he built something for the day I was ready to receive it. He planted an inheritance in the ground like a seed, and he waited, and he trusted that I would come. If you've ever felt written off, if you've ever had someone look at what you have and decide it wasn't worth anything, if you've ever inherited something that looked like nothing and turned out to be the only thing that mattered, you are not alone. Tell me this. What is the deed in your life that someone tossed away without reading? Leave it in the comments below. I read every single one. Thank you for listening.